All right, we're in a brand new series called Crash and Burn, and here's a phrase that you have heard, or a couple words you've heard that everybody used to say a few years ago, but hot mess, and I've got to just do this real quick. Okay, there's a line that's not equal to the line, and this is my issues that I'm in counseling for. So, hot mess. So back in the, some of you understand, 19th century, this had to do with military, specifically around food. So think mess hall. So that's where hot mess originated. And then the 20th century, it changed a little bit, and it still had to do with military, but it had to do more with military conflict, specifically something like a firefight. And so literally hot mess. And then in the 21st century, it evolved, specifically the word hot evolved in terms of how it's used. And so it began to be known as an attractive disaster. So your life could be a mess or off the rails or dysfunctional or something that's just completely out of there. And yet the goal was basically to maintain functionality and still look attractive while you're doing it. That's what a hot mess is. So like you're a mess, life is off the rails, but you're still functioning and you look good while you're doing it, which is kind of, I think, the goal a lot of times maybe for Americans is just everybody pretends, just act like you're good, keep going, keep grinding. How you doing? Fine, everything's fine. As long as you look the part and you keep going and you look good while you're doing it, nobody cares, right? And so that's just kind of what we do. In fact, for some of you, that maybe has been your issues with the church, where you walk into church and it just feels like everybody else has it together and you and you don't have it together, and there's some areas of your life where you just kind of feel like a failure, and you'd look around and think, does anybody else struggle? And everybody looks so good when you walk in, because church people lie a lot, and there's a lot of I'm just going to say what's true. There's hypocrisy that just kind of is bred in religion, and so we just think we got to show up and grind and look good and look the part, which is so damaging. And so I just want you to look around for just a second. No matter how good anybody looks in here, and nobody dressed up today, but no matter how good anybody looks in here, I'm just playing. Everybody's a mess. Like, just look around. To your right, to your left, everybody has failure at some point along the way. In fact, that is really what our common ground is, that we have failed. We are failing, at least at some area, and we're going to fail in the future. And this is not to say that you're not living healthy and whole. In fact, that's the goal of this series. But if we're all honest, we've all been there. There is no way you have walked through life unscathed without some failure at some point along the way where you just haven't measured up. Now, that's what we're going to talk about for 4 weeks. I'm not talking about good failure, and there is good failure. Like, there is certain successes that are not going to come without failure. You know, the whole adage, if you ain't failing, you ain't trying. So there is good failure. I'm talking about more specifically the avoidable, a lot of times, messy, regret creating failure that all of us have had at some point along the way. There could be a relational failure. It could be a family failure, and you're dealing with an ex, or you're dealing with a kid that's just, you don't know what to do now. It could be a financial failure, and you've got some consumer debt and just some decisions you've made, and you just kind of feel like a failure in that area, and you're trying to climb yourself out of it. It could be a physical failure where you have made some direct decisions or ignored some decisions that now are impacting your health, and it's just, you just kind of feel like it's a mess. There's a little bit of a failure there. For others of us, it's a habit. And it was a habit that started as kind of, it felt like just a momentary decision, but that decision kind of became a pathway. And now there's a feeling of just failure and mess around the habit that you can't seem to kick now. I mean, there's so many things, but the common ground is, religious or not, we all have them. And in fact, in this series, I'm going to kind of talk about failure and the mess as synonymous, because the byproduct of failure, the kind of failure I'm talking about, the could have avoided it, did it anyway, kind of failure, always produces mess. There's always complications, and not just for our lives, generally for other people's lives around us, because, our decisions are never localized. We can never contain them. They always impact other people. So we talk about failure. There's a mess that comes with that failure that we're going to talk about. Now, if we're honest, for some of us, we made the mess. So if you're just talking about failure that leads to mess, meaning you kind of knew. You kind of saw it coming in some ways. These are the worst ones. And again, we've all done it, so don't feel bad about yourself. We've all done it. And this is why I say often, for some of us, there's nobody who's let us down or undermined us more than us and our own future decisions that we've made that have worked against us. But you kind of saw it coming and you did it anyway. And so you just kind of made the mess. For others of us, we married the mess. This is why mess is better, because to say I'm married to failure doesn't, you married the mess. For some of you, you had so many people. You had 3 ex-girlfriends warn you. They're like, you should run for the hills. and you ignored all three of them. And you're like, it's going to be different. I'll fix them, or whatever your thing is. And this is just for free. You can fix a dog. You can't fix a spouse. So some of you married a mess. Others of you feel like, again, no eye contact, don't talk about it on the way home. It's not that kind of message. You feel like you're being parented by a mess a little bit. Others of you feel like you're parenting a mess, where there's just some stuff that have happened and it's just gone a little bit sideways and you're not really sure what to do. And sometimes you don't know how it happened. And this is so tough because being a parent, it's so easy to live under this umbrella feeling like a failure anyway. But like some stuff has happened and you don't know how to get it back or you don't know how to fix a relationship. It just feels like you're in a mess. And then the other thing is, this is the most difficult one. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit less, but it's still relevant in introducing. And that is, some of us were dragged into a mess that somebody else, did. I mean, this is, maybe you didn't marry a mess, but you married into a mess. And there's all kind of stuff in terms of, you just didn't see that coming. You should have interviewed the in-laws first. I mean, whatever it is. There's stuff that somebody else did. Again, it wasn't your failure. This is so difficult. So it wasn't your failure. It wasn't your decision. But again, because you can't contain it, you're dealing with the mess of somebody else's decision. And you were just kind of drug into it. And so my point in all of that is we just all have it. Maybe you're in an amazing season right now where you're like, nope, no failures, no messes. I am rolling. That's incredible. You're in between messes or failures. But still, it's just so important to recognize, but you've been there. Some of us are there, or you're in between, and you're going to be there again. You're not going to get it all perfect. And it's just so important to recognize, especially for church people, that you are one decision away from a failure or a mess. In fact, this is the good news. You don't get anything else in the series. This is hey, if you take notes, you should take notes and write this down. Put it on your mirror. This is the thing to take away with you if the rest of this gets really boring. This is the good news. There's always someone whose life is a bigger failure and mess than yours. I'm just kidding. That's not the good news. That's a little bit mean. You're like, that is good. I just no, it's true, but that's not the good news. The good news is this is our common ground. Like religious or not religious. And I don't care what people around you look like. This is the advantage I have to what I do, because I talk with so many people. I've had hundreds of conversations. I mean, I've heard everything that you can possibly imagine. And even when you think somebody has it all together, I mean, so many times where I've been like, oh no, just the outward veneer does not match what's going on the inside. I'm just telling you, people so often do not look what they portray just in terms of life, social media, whatever. But this is our common ground, despite what you've experienced from the church, despite what you think from other people, despite how you've been judged. It is not just you. This is a common experience. We're all there. We all relate. And oftentimes nobody fully knows about it. But it brings us all together, whether you're struggling to believe God or you believed God or followed Jesus your entire life. Which means, just real quick, it means we should be so slow to criticize other people. And that is so easy for me to say, but that is kind of our natural inclination and where human nature takes us. So I get the struggle. It is so easy to criticize other people who fail in different ways than you. It is so easy to size people up and write them off. It's so easy to go, what's wrong with you? Are you kidding me? How stupid could you be? I mean, it is so easy, but specifically Jesus followers, but this is for anybody. We should lean in the direction of being students more than we are critics of other people. Like we should work with everything in us to be students more than we're critics, meaning you don't really know why somebody does what they do, why they make the decisions they make, why they hurt who they hurt, why they have behaved in some of the ways they behave, until you know some of the mess and some of the failure that they're walking out of, some of the mess or the failure that was even handed to them. And that doesn't excuse, that doesn't let them off the hook. It just recognizes that there is a context to everybody. This is why one of our core values that is really important to me is progress at your pace, meaning as the church, we should meet everybody where they are and move to inspire and lead them toward progress, specifically as they, maybe factor in or encounter Jesus. But it also recognizes that everybody's at a different starting point, and you should not judge somebody else based on where you are or fail to remember where you've been, because everybody's dealt a different hand. Everybody's walking out of a different kind of scenario. Everybody has been handed something you don't know anything about. And many times when you sit down with somebody and you hear their context and their story, your response is, oh. And it doesn't let them off the hook, doesn't absolve them of, consequences. it just recognizes that there is so much complexity to all of our stories. This is what we're gonna look at next week with Jesus. One of the confusing things about Jesus in the Gospels that can seem confusing is that Jesus dealt with different people in different ways constantly. In fact, if you read them, sometimes you're like, Jesus, you're so inconsistent. And Jesus is like, yeah, I am. Because there's not one size fits all for anybody. The church shouldn't react that way either or act that way, because Jesus understood everybody had a different story, a different background, was coming from a different place, and so he met them where they were. It's not just us. We should have a tremendous amount of empathy and grace for other people. In fact, for some of you, again, hasn't that been some of your issues with church? Because you went through a season. This is the thing that breaks my heart, and is why we try to do something. We're not going to get it right, but different with what we're doing as a church, because you were judged so harshly during a season where you failed and you felt like things were a mess, and yet you were judged harshly and nobody listened to your story. Nobody sat down to hear the context. Nobody sat down to understand the full narrative of everything that you were coming from. This is why Jesus in the New Testament says these famous words where he's like, you should make it the habit of your life to stare long and hard into the mirror on like a daily basis. He says this, you maybe heard it. First, take the what? Take the 2x4 out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly in terms of what's going on around you. Not to judge, as we're going to see, judge other people harshly, but there are other people that need help. There are other people that need your voice or your presence in their life. But when you do this long enough, and I'm just telling you, the longer you have been a Christian or been in church culture, which so often is not synonymous with Jesus, the harder you need to work at this to stare in the mirror until you walk away with extraordinary amounts of empathy and grace for other people. And the only reason that we don't is because we forget, we lack awareness. And come on, I know you probably know this, but I'm gonna say it anyway. This is just human nature. It's weird about our psychology that you tend to judge in other people most harshly what you see in you. I mean, that should stop us in our tracks. That every time you get, and there's this angst and you point fingers and I can't believe them and are you kidding me? That in most cases, what you feel is present in you, which is why you feel so strongly about it. But when you walk away and you do this on a regular basis, that it just does something inside of you. And come on, isn't this true? And this is why I loved Ivy's story. And just shout out to her for the courage to do that. Yeah. There's some messes we can't climb out of ourselves. Like there's some failure. In fact, there was somebody after the first service, and this wasn't even something that he created, but it was something that just happened around him where his life got into a place where it was just so hard. And he's like, at the time, I wasn't rooted in any kind of community. I didn't have people around me. And it was so difficult. He's like, I had to try to navigate it all alone. He was talking about how grateful he is over this last year to have found this church and community, because there's certain messes and failure we can't climb out of ourselves. Like we need other people. I mean, come on. Can you imagine if the church had just gotten this one thing right? Like if we were people who stared long and hard into the mirror with extraordinary amounts of empathy and grace for other individuals and recognized what was going on in us to the point that we wouldn't judge, but we actually could be a help to other people around us. I mean, come on, I'll just tell you straight up, there is not a lot of people, specifically in Western Christianity, who when they think Christian thinks empathy and grace. But man, if we just, this is why, again, one of our core values, lead core values as a church, is that this would be the safest place in the world for anybody struggling with anything. Not that we would just talk about it, but it would actually be that. That we stop just looking pretty and pretending and just recognizing this is what puts us all on common ground. In fact, this is what Christians believe, Jesus followers believe. Christians actually believe that the failure and the mess that brings us together, and it does, whether we realize it or not, the failure and the mess that brings us together is actually the failure and the mess that brought God near. That there is an upside to your failure and mess, and specifically the recognition of your failure and mess, because the failure and mess that we recognize and that brings us all together on common ground, like the thing that we have in common is me too, is actually the thing that brought God near, that God moved in our direction. And we just need to be reminded of this. I know some of you know the story, but if you were to think in the first century, or you just to know or study the pantheon of gods and how people viewed the gods or God in religion, nobody expected what Jesus did. Nobody expected what Jesus showed up with. Nobody expected for a God to condescend into human flesh. The ideas of gods were distant, they were removed, you can't approach, and if you do, you might get struck down. But for a God to condescend and to become human flesh, like Jesus, God in a body, it's why Jesus said things like, if you want to know what God's like, watch me, look at me, observe my life. This is why the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John are so important. Jesus was God in a body, and he moved to planet Earth and moved in our direction and did what nobody could have imagined. There was no existing narrative for a God that saw the mess, saw the failure, and moved into the mess and failure without condemning. Nobody expected that. They had no category for that kind of God. They had the category not for God of grace. They had a category for God of judgment that some, even in our culture, still have trouble getting past and don't quite understand how to interpret the scriptures, and the fact that Jesus is the hermeneutic for how to interpret everything else. But they thought God of judgment, and they thought that all the religious people would sit in the jury box to judge, because that's what all of us tend to think. And then God shows up and enters the mess, not to condemn, but to recognize that the mess and the failure is our common ground, and it's actually the thing that moved God in our direction. In fact, the failure and the mess is actually the lens through which we discover God. One of the things I want you to get to understand as we start the series off and as we go, is that the very thing right now that causes maybe so much shame and so much sense of like, I don't measure up, I'm telling you that thing can be redefined. It is actually an invitation for God's presence and for God to begin to work. It is a lens through it. In fact, without your recognition of failure and mess, you're never gonna discover God. In fact, to recognize the failure and the mess is a baby step away. This is so important from acknowledging God. That even if you're not sure about God today, there is a sense in which you cannot acknowledge one without acknowledging the other. That the moment you begin to acknowledge the fact that you feel there's a mess or there's a failure without realizing it, you are actually beginning to acknowledge God. Or maybe you already believe God, follow Jesus, and yet you kind of walked away. That the very recognition of your failure and your mess is actually a baby step in the direction of God. And the very fact that you are aware is God inviting you to experience him and to experience healing and to experience wholeness. One of the guys that articulated this the best was the guy by the name of Apostle Paul. Saul changed his name to Paul. Actually had it changed for him because, Jesus can do those things. He's like, we were just changing your name. So he became Paul. Paul was a Pharisee or a religious leader and highly educated. We've talked about him a lot because he wrote so much in the New Testament. And tries to stamp out the Jesus movement, becomes a Jesus follower, becomes the greatest church planter in history, begins to plant churches all over the Mediterranean rim. And he comes along and he articulates this whole idea that your failure and your mess is actually the lens through which you discover God. And to acknowledge the failure and mess, maybe without knowing it, is to actually begin to acknowledge God in your life. Here's how Paul says it. You guys still with me? Okay, thanks, Gus. Appreciate it, man. Paul says this, we know. But some of us do, others don't. So Paul's informing us. Now that we know that the law said, whatever the law says, it says to those who are what? Under the law. And there's a broad application that narrows down. So just go with me. There's a first application that could be any kind of law. This could be civil law. This could be national law. This could be the rules or the law of your school. This could be the rules or the law of your industry. That there is a broader application here. And he's making a really important point that those rules and laws don't apply unless you are under them or have placed yourself under them. So like you can tell me all day long the rules of your industry. I don't care. I don't work in your industry. You can tell me about the rules of your school, the laws of your school. Doesn't affect me. I'm not at your school. I never enrolled, which is really important because for generations, Christians have tried to hold people who are not Christians to Christian standards, but they never signed up to be a Christian. And I heard a half clap because you weren't sure if you could clap, but you can. So we so easily judge other people to go, this is the standard of, If you haven't signed up to follow Jesus, you are not accountable to Jesus' standards. And I'm just going to tell you, we're so guilty of that where we live in our nation, where we so want to legislate on other people what we believe. And yet you will never find that from Jesus anywhere in the Gospels. In fact, the opposite in terms of them living under a really crazy regime in Rome. They never did that because everybody has the ability to believe and do what they want. God's not going to stiff arm his way on anybody. And we, to quote Paul in 1 Corinthians, you can go look it up for yourself. We have no business judging people who have never placed themselves under the standard of God. It's none of our business. I didn't say that, Paul did. So he says, whatever the law is. Now, if you're a Christian, then you actually have placed yourself under the law of Christ. Nobody else has if they haven't signed on, but you have. You willingly went, I want to follow God, I want to follow Jesus specifically. And so you place yourself under the law of Christ, and Jesus summarized what the law of Christ was. It was, I want you to love other people the way that God has loved you in Christ. That God came through Jesus to show off what it looked like to follow God. That the question for Jesus followers to answer in every realm and every decision of their life is, what does love demand? That there's no longer a list and a bunch of rules. It's, if I'm not sure what to say or do, what does love demand of you? That God came and gave us one law that summarized all other laws. And so whatever law that is, whether it is the law of Christ that we placed ourselves under, or, this is so interesting, even if you don't believe in God, for a lot of us, there's this thing, even our own standards for our own life that we live under. It's like every once in a while, maybe you stood up at, or stared up at the ceiling, not stood on the ceiling, you stared up at the ceiling, and you've gone, man, what's wrong with me? Why did I make that decision? Why did I do that? There's some kind of haunting regret from the past. And you don't even factor in God, but there's like some kind of standard for your own life, and you haven't lived up to your own standard for your own life. I mean, to go a step further, it's so interesting how almost universally, there are certain things all around the world in every generation that people would agree, that's just like a should do that or shouldn't do that, or to quote C.S. Lewis, you ought to do that, you ought not to do that. And almost universal, there's an agreement on that, even if there's no acknowledgement of God. But then the other thing with that is that there's kind of this standard, whether it's our standard or God's standard, that we live under. And then people will say things like this when they don't meet it, because inevitably they don't, or they fail, or they let themselves down. They'll say, nobody is perfect. Nobody's perfect. Like, nobody gets it all right. Everybody fails, even if they don't know where the standard came from. There's some kind of standard of what we ought to do and what we ought not to do, which means, to kind of sound like Yoda for a second, there is a perfect that nobody is. Like, there is a perfect, like there is some kind of standard. We maybe don't even know where the standard comes from, but we all have acknowledged the fact that we don't meet it. And so Paul continues on to say, therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the what? The verse hadn't come up yet. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the what? That no one will be right with God or made right or, have their life right simply by going, well, I'm just going to be perfect. I'm going to try harder. I'm going to get better. I'm going to, get on some kind of 90-day new you plan. It's not going to work. That nobody's going to make things right by just kind of trying harder. Rather, is there music playing somewhere? Okay, so we take care of that. That'd be awesome. I thought I was going crazy. I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't. By the works of the law, rather, through the law, we become what? Conscious of our sin, meaning none of us is perfect. We all have a standard, even if we're not sure where the standard comes from. All of us fall short. And then he says this in the next verse. There it is. Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law. And then verse 20. There we go. So that every mouth may be what? Silenced, and the whole world held accountable to God. And this is Paul's direct language, which he often speaks very directly to say, there's a standard. Might be God's standard. Might be your own standard. There's just something going on where you've let you down, you haven't measured up. And all of us would acknowledge, and we'll use language like, well, nobody's perfect, that everybody has fallen short. And here's Paul's point, it's so important. And that everybody is silenced from condemning anybody else, because you all fall short. You've all been there. All of us can say me too. None of us have met whatever the standard is for our life. And so we are silenced to condemn anybody else. And what he's saying is, and everybody's accountable, meaning sometimes church people think just because well, here's what I think you should do. Here's what you ought to do. Here's what you shouldn't do. By the very acknowledgement of what you should do, sometimes we think that we're better. Like acknowledgement of the law makes us better. And Paul's like, acknowledgement of the law doesn't make you better. It just makes you accountable. It just means you recognize that there is something outside of you that you are accountable to. For followers of Jesus to love others the way that God has loved you, knowing that we don't always meet that standard. So he says, therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of our sin. We all fall short. All of us at some point along the way knew better, and we did it anyway. And so here's the question that's kind of uncomfortable, a little bit in your face, but it's important to ask. Here's the question for all of us. What does the law, again, whether it's your internal law, you're not even sure about God yet, or it's the law of Christ, what does the law that you're under remind you that you're not? For all of us. And this is where all of us are on an equal plane. What does the law that you're under remind you that you're not? It's a habit. It's an addiction. It's I didn't follow through. It's an anger issue that keeps seeping onto other people. It's a lack of faithfulness. It's laziness. It's some other thing. It's I went behind their backs. It's I ignored. It's I walked out. It's a relational mess. It's a financial mess. It's some kind of habit that now has grown and you're not sure how to unwind from the habit. But what does the law that you're under remind you ultimately that you're not? And here's the thing that is so important. The reason that you can recognize a mess or a failure is because you have a reference point for it. In fact, you wouldn't even acknowledge the mess or the failure in your life if you didn't have some kind of comparison of non-failure or non-mess. And you have to ask the question, even if I'm not sure where the standard came from, there is a standard that originated somewhere and I am under that standard. And here's the thing about the law that Paul makes so clear. The law can't and won't make you better. The law or the rules just help you understand what a mess you are. Welcome to church. Right? Like it doesn't make you better. It doesn't inspire you. In fact, some of you grew up in environments where people didn't maybe leverage this in the wrong way, where they actually drove you deeper into failure and deeper into the mess. They used the Bible as a bat or a weapon. It didn't inspire you to anything. In fact, some of us even know this as kids. This is why in our home, don't take it from me because my kids are still growing up and maybe we're going to totally swing and miss on all this. But we only have like 3 rules. Every other rule kind of comes off of that because the more rules you have, they don't necessarily inspire you to better behavior. They just give you more ideas, right? Everybody remembers as a kid, you get certain things, they didn't inspire you to be great. One, this is just a weird example, but I'll never forget one time going to my grandparents' house when I was, I was pretty young still, and they live in the Appalachians, so she had this huge hill, mountain in Florida terms, but massive steep hill, and we get there, it's like, oh, this is super cool, she just moved into this place, and immediately my dad was like, hey, don't ride your bike down that hill. And it didn't inspire me to greater behavior. It immediately gave me an idea that I hadn't thought of previously. And what did I do? I rode my bike down the hill and almost killed myself. But the rules in the law don't inspire. They don't change you. They don't make you better. They just let you know you're a mess and you're a failure and you need help. But the only reason we know this is so important, the only reason you feel that is because there's some kind of standard that you know to measure yourself up against. And so 3 verses later, Paul sums it all up with these famous verses that some of you know, for all have what? Sinned, or if you're not there yet, you've let you down, for all have sinned and all fall short of the glory, or literally the standard that God created that we know that we can't meet. And every time we recognize the failure or the mess without knowing it, it is actually an invitation for God's presence in our life. It's God reminding us, I know, you're right, you can't do it. You did fail. It's why I entered the mess, and I'm inviting you toward healing and restoration. In fact, for some of you, just that shift in thinking would begin to help you, that literally your acknowledgement of your failure and your mess before anything even changes is actually God beginning to already work in your heart and in your life, because awareness of our failure and our messes actually awakens us to something outside of us to which we're accountable. We didn't create it. we didn't make it up. It's just there. That our awareness of our failure and our messes awakens us to something outside of us, which we are accountable. In fact, not so that we can try harder, not so that you can run out of here to go, here's 7 things, get better, be perfect. So that you would acknowledge God, that you need a Savior and you need help and I need help. One of the most brilliant theologians and philosophers, one of my favorite, C.S. Lewis, and I have several of his first edition copies on my shelves. I love his writing so much. Post-World War II, philosopher, theologian, highly educated, and was not a follower of Jesus for a long time. His writings are brilliant if you ever read his stuff or watch the movies based off his stuff. And C.S. Lewis got to the place, though, where he began to grapple with exactly what I just talked about. And the whole idea of this, our failures and our messes being a lens to discover God, and the recognition of our failures and messes is actually a step away from recognizing God. That whole idea actually led C.S. Lewis to believe and embrace Jesus and believe that Jesus actually was the Son of God. And he writes in his classic work, Mere Christianity, and I think it's so brilliant, where he argues the fact that anybody who argues over what is morally right, like there's just and unjust, there's fair and unfair, there's right and wrong, that anybody who ever argues that, like you shouldn't do that, you shouldn't lie, you shouldn't have ripped me off, you shouldn't have walked out, you shouldn't have done that behind my back, you shouldn't have treated me that way, that anybody anywhere on planet Earth that has that argument ever about right, not right, just, unjust, fair, not fair. Anybody who has that argument is actually appealing to a standard that they, this is so interesting, expect the other person to acknowledge. That they expect the other person to know about. And then C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity goes on to say, and when they're in those arguments, whether it's, an atheist, an agnostic, 2 atheists, a Jesus follower, and somebody who doesn't believe in God at all, it doesn't matter who it is, that when they're in that argument, nobody, direct quote from C.S. Lewis, nobody says to hell with the standard. What they may do is argue about, what somebody did or didn't do or how they failed or didn't fail, but they don't argue to abolish the standard. They argue toward the standard, even if they don't believe there's a God or don't know where the standard came from. And so C.S. Lewis's question in Mere Christianity was, where did that standard that we hold to and we acknowledge that we didn't create, where did it come from? What is the standard we appeal to that we didn't make up on our own? And here's what C.S. Lewis says, to quote Mere Christianity. The law of gravity tells you that what stones do if you drop them. You drop a stone, you know exactly what's going to happen. But the law of human nature tells you what human beings ought to do, because there's certain ought and ought nots that are just hardwired in us, and they don't do. And then he goes on to say this, that human beings all over the earth, every generation, have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way, and they can't really get rid of it. It's so interesting. It's so interesting to watch people who again, no belief in God appeal to a moral standard that other people should live under according to their worldview. But where did the standard come from? And yet there's some kind of standard. There's something that in every generation, almost anywhere in the world, it just won't leave us. It just won't go away. We can't extricate. We can't rid ourselves of it. And then C.S. Lewis ends by saying this: there is something above and beyond the ordinary facts of men's behavior, and yet quite definitely real. A real law, something going on, which none of us made, but which we find pressing on us. And we believe that the pressing on us, that thing, that conscious, that standard, even for our own life, even if we don't acknowledge it, is actually the presence of God. That God is the originator of that standard. God is the creator of that standard. That thing that you feel, even though you maybe walked away from faith a decade ago, or you kind of believe in there's Jesus and whatever, but I stopped following a long time ago, that thing is the presence of God. And God is inviting you into something deeper. That the failure and the mess that you feel is not rejection. It's God inviting you into something. It's the acknowledgement of God doing something in your life. And as I said earlier, your failure, an acknowledgement of failure and mess, is actually a baby step away from acknowledging God. The recognition of a standard that we all recognize, whether we know where it came from. And here's the reality: God can't heal what you conceal. God can't heal what you don't reveal. Not that you need to reveal it to him. He already knows what you're not willing to reveal to yourself. That there's some messes, there's some failures, and the acknowledgement of that mess and failure is actually an acknowledgement of God in my life. And it's God inviting me into healing and hope and wholeness. But the bottom line is this: as we in week one. We all have this in common. We all have this one thing in common. And over the next couple weeks, we're going to talk about moving toward healing and wholeness and what some of those steps are. But in the meantime, this is actually the starting point, because the thing that you have in common with the people that you don't like, with the guy that's going to come into work tomorrow and you're like, oh, there he is again. To the person that I can't stand them. I can't believe. Are you serious? Why would they do that? They're such a mess. The thing that we all have in common with those people, whoever those people are in your life, is me too. Me too. I was in a failure. I'm in a failure now. We'll be in a failure. None of us are immune from it. The thing that we can all say is we all fall short, even if we don't know where the standard comes from. And, quote Paul, we have all been left silenced to judge or condemn anybody else. And so this is actually the starting place, because we're going to talk about what it looks like for you to move forward and to heal and for God to work in your life and find wholeness. And the fact that you acknowledge today there's a mess and a failure is actually God already at work. But this is actually the starting place, because the outflow of what we feel in our own failure and mess is always projected on other people. So this week, I just want to give you this one practice. When you see the mess coming, the mess shows up in a text message, come over to your house, they walk 3 cubicles over, you see them in the neighborhood and try to get the garage door down real fast before you have to say hi. Wherever the mess and the failure is, here's what I want you to think when you're so tempted to criticize and judge and ignore your own stuff to point out their stuff. Here's what we all need to just say to ourselves. I know failure and mess when I see one, because I've been one. When you see him or her coming, and you immediately go to whatever, just stop, take a pause and go, you know why I can recognize that failure and mess? I know failure and mess when I see one, because I've been one. In fact, let's just all uncomfortably say this together to practice real quick. I know failure and mess when I see one, because I've been one. One more time, like you mean it. I know failure and mess when I see one, because I've been one. If we could just do this, you imagine what it could change? That we spent every single day in the mirror long enough to where people in our culture said, you know what about the Christians? They do crazy stuff, and I don't understand a lot of the stuff, and their theology sometimes is really weird. But you know what is true about those people? They're the most empathetic, gracious individuals that I have ever seen in my life. And they're so aware of themselves, they don't have any time to judge and point fingers at anybody else. They're just there to help. They're just there to help carry somebody else's burden. They're just there to help lift somebody else out of the mess and out of the failure. And the only reason you know a failure is because you were one. You are one. You're going to be one. And when we talk about healing and wholeness over the next couple weeks, maybe, counterintuitively, you acknowledging this is actually the pathway for you beginning to take a step in the direction of that wholeness and that healing. And so, crash and burn, failure is inevitable. It's not fatal. There's extraordinary hope. And the fact that you feel the failure and the mess is God's invitation toward healing. It's why next week, you shouldn't miss next week, because this message was just a setup. And I think it's going to give so many people hope. I know it's part 2. You shouldn't miss inviting somebody next week. And if you want to follow along, we're now creating reading plans that we create specifically for these series every single time. There's 3 devotionals per week. Again, you don't have to believe. This is just part of following. Begin to investigate. Text reading plan to 94,000, reading plan to 94,000, or go to the app. We'd love for you to follow along with this. They'll text you or email depending on what you sign up for. But I just want to leave you with this. It is not just you. This is our common ground. And the fact that you feel it is God inviting you into something even better. Would you guys pray with me? Jesus, thank you for your grace, for your goodness, for leading us. Thank you that you are a God that didn't stand back and judge, condemn, or just start over because of our failure and mess, but you entered into it. You took on the consequences of it. You came so that we could know that where we feel it, it is an invitation for God to restore. You came to seek and to save the lost, and we've all been lost. Our lost are going to be lost. And so I just pray that you would help us to lean into this, and that you would give us the wisdom to know what to do, and you give us the courage to do it. And we pray all of this in Jesus' incredible name. Amen.